Okay, I'm Bob Jackson, and this is 2011,
Yeah, August
and
14th, 15th.
40 years ago this summer, maybe a little over 40, we decided to come up here as a college student because we had some friends. I say a friend of mine, a college buddy of mine. I'd already graduated. I was in grad school. And I kind of tired of going to school at the time, Vietnam era and so forth. And we had some friends up working in Grand Lake, Tommy Bond and Bob Scott. And we had heard through the rumor mill that we could get a job up here, that they would help us or so. So at the end of the semester, the spring semester 71, my friend Tim had graduated, and of course, as I said, I'd already graduated and decided to pause my studies, come up here for a summer job. I originally had intended a summer job here, a winter job in one of the resorts, a springtime job in the Bahamas, and then I was going to Europe, back around Europe. And if I liked it, I was going to stay a while. If I didn't, I was going to come back and finish my master's. So we headed out of Nacogdoches, Texas, somewhere around May. I don't remember when the graduation time was, but after he had graduated. He bought a Honda 750 motorcycle for just a few weeks before the trip. And he had never ridden a motorcycle in his life. But we'd seen the movie Easy Rider, and while it was a little bit heavy on the hippie side, on the freedom of running around side, it looked pretty good. So in our minds, that was us. We hit the trail. I had a Triumph car, TR6, brand new in 71. And I packed the gear, and he got on his bike, and we thought a 1,200 mile trip wasn't any big deal. Well, it was a pretty big deal, because even though he could drive faster than I could, he couldn't last very long. About every 50 miles or so, we'd have to stop and take a break. So it took us a while. We didn't have much money back then, and our parents weren't really thrilled with what we were doing. So we were kind of limited on our resources. And we camped out along the road, along the highway as we came up. Just wherever we got that we were tired enough to quit, we quit. And as we were progressing, we would run across farmers or just individual people, in some cases people that we thought were old-timers in their 40s. Has-beens as far as we were concerned, but we would say, hey, why don't you just give up and go, hit the road. One guy almost did, but he almost joined us. But anyway, just Tim and I. And we got a map out, looked at the roads and how to get to Colorado. And some of the shortcuts up to Denver and the Grand Lake were gray lines on the map, which, as it ended up, were gravel roads that we didn't know at the time. You can imagine driving a convertible and a motorcycle hitting on gravel roads. I mean, it was ding, ding, ding under the car and no telling what on the bike. But after a few days, I remember we slept out on the highway, or right on the side of the highway in Amarillo, or just out of Amarillo, between Amarillo and Dumas. And that was an interesting experience, because right there on the major highway with big 18-wheelers going by, it's a tough night to sleep. But anyway, we made it up into Colorado, and then we ran into a snowstorm, which we were extremely surprised at, being Texas boys. We couldn't imagine a snowstorm in May. It was a pretty heavy storm, one of the commonly frequent ones, as you know. And we were just coming into Colorado Springs. One of the little towns before, I don't remember where, probably around La Junta or what have you, but we had to stop in a gas station and he found some work gloves because he wasn't wearing gloves. We started out short sleeve shirts and I don't know, long pants, but anyway, that soon changed. And it was tough riding that motorcycle in that blizzard. Now, certainly I wasn't having a problem. But the higher in elevation we got, the tougher it was for his bike to run, plus the cold. So we got to a point where it was sputtering about, and it was getting dark. So we pulled off side of the road again. Interstate 25 wasn't finished at the time, and I mean you could get transportation was moving, but it wasn't the 4 or 6 or 8 lanes or whatever it is now, just around the Colorado Springs area. And so it was getting dark. We pulled off side road, parked the car parallel to the wind. The snow had all stopped by then, and we put our sleeping bags out alongside the road with the car protecting us somewhat. And I carried a tarp with me for some reason. We had a tarp, so we put the tarp over the two of us. And just in case it snowed, well, sure enough it did. Woke up the next morning with about 6 or 7 inches of snow on top of us, which was an interesting experience in itself. And then he couldn't get his bike started. What an ordeal. I tried getting a rope and pulling it behind the car to make it start, but that wasn't successful. And by the way, when we woke up that morning, we looked across the highway, and we were at the equivalent of what is now the northern entrance to the Air Force Academy. So every time I pass by that nowadays, I flip back 40 some odd years and can't believe that that's where we were spending the night. But we eventually made it into Denver. I think by the time we got to Denver, we found a place to rent for about a month so we can come up to Grand Lake and look around, find a job, a base. And it was 1600 Pennsylvania Street. I remember it well because it's 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. A little bit of a difference, but we were in the basement of some environmental company, and we rented it pretty cheaply for a month, and we only had about $3 left in our pockets. And this is on a Friday afternoon. We had no food, $3 left between the two of us. So we bought a pound of coffee, loaf of bread, and we lived on the bread and the coffee for a couple of days. We had, I don't know, $1 or so left over, and in those days you get those McDonald's hamburgers. We were right in downtown Denver, in kind of a tough area. We didn't know, but a lot of hippies and prostitutes and druggies and everything all around over the place. But we made it through, got a few, I don't know, 20 or 25 cent McDonald's hamburgers, and survived till Monday till our parents could wire us some money. Came on up here to Grand Lake. Tim found a job with the Davenhaven. That's when Tom and Betty Sewell had it. And he was washing dishes. And I found a job with the Grand Lake Boat Service. Lyle Killion owned it back then. And he interviewed me and talked with me for a while. He'd already hired a number of people, but found out I knew a pretty good bit about boats. And so anyway, he hired me, and he gave me an option that was at about, I don't remember the salary. It seemed like it was about $1.50 an hour. Maybe $1. It must have been $1. Must have been $1.75 if you didn't stay in the boathouse, or $1.60 an hour if you did. And I chose not to stay in the boathouse. I rented the old stagecoach stop,
Kaufman House.
the Kaufman House. It was vacant. Gordon Spitzmiller, I think it was, either owned it or he was in charge of it. I don't remember, but I do remember it had 7 bedrooms. And I had the bottom bedroom nearest the lake, and right outside my window, and it still grows there today, rhubarb. And rhubarb doesn't grow in the South. And so that was my first experience at rhubarb. And cut the stalks and ate some of the stalks and so forth. And I was told don't eat the leaves, they're poisonous. But stayed there for the summer, the only heat we had in that house. And we didn't tear it up or destroy it or anything. I mean, we were just staying there. I rented out, I don't know, 3 or 4 of the other rooms. We didn't get them all rented out to help reduce my expenses on the rent. But the only heat we had in there was the heat of a water heater, which was in the bathroom. And that's not much heat. One little bitty old flame underneath a water heater in the entire house. Now, summers are not bad, but still gets a little bit nippy. But had a good time. Worked for Lyle Killion. We took in those days we had Jeep tours and boat tours. We of course had to learn the stories around the lake, and some of the stories we learned were stories, and some of them were real truths. In some cases we just made stuff up, particularly when you didn't have an answer for things. And the Jeep tours were in the various mountains. We did Corona Pass, and we did a tour up, I can't think of the name right now, but kind of a local tour up toward Bowen Mountain. And North Supply, that's the name of it, North Supply. And this was real interesting. Here I am, an old Texas boy up here showing tourists around, telling them about Colorado. One time I had one of the tourists ask me, where's the mountain with all the faces on it? Wrong state, it's Mount Rushmore. But, people don't know, I guess. But really enjoyed that summer. We were in charge of renting out boats for the tourists. And in those days, the boat tours that we took were in Chris Craft's, wooden Chris Craft's. I'm not even sure Chris Craft was making fiberglass boats in '71. They might have just started. Anyway, all our boats were wooden. And there were 2 large boats, which were the primary boats for tours, except when we had just a few people, we'd take smaller boats. But the 2 large boats were the Dream Boat and the Show Boat. They were 35, 36-foot Chris Craft cruisers, and they would accommodate, I don't know, somewhere around 15 or 20 people. And it was quite handy for us. The bigger the tour, the better, because we'd get some tips, and $1.60 or so an hour is a little tough to live on, even though it's not as bad as it sounds today. I think $1.50 an hour was minimum wage back then. But just kids frolicking around, playing and having a good time. That's all of our intent. I made it through the summer with the Jeep tours and so forth. And I particularly remember learning some of the mountain ranges and some of the flora about the area, and in some cases some little flowers that I thought ought to have a certain name. I just tell them, well, it's a forget-me-not or what have you. But it was a forget-me-not because I still remember it to this day. But after the summer was
Wait a minute. What did you do for fun? It wasn't all work.
Oh no! We'd hang out over at Foghorn. That was a primary place. We'd go to the Foghorn and the Rapids. Both of them had bars, and the Foghorn was just pretty well strictly bar. Rapid had a little food, but the Foghorn, and that was the early days of John Denver, and we'd sit around listening to his Rocky Mountain High and some of his songs, sing along with the, I can't remember the name of the song, but the one about sun coming up, got cakes on the griddle.
Mm-hmm.
And other ones, and I mean, we just dated tourists or tried to find other girls around. Humphrey's store hired sorority girls and local girls both to work their store, and they had, I don't know, 8 or 10, maybe a few more girls working for them. And the boat boys, they were probably, I don't know, 10 or 12 or so of us, and we'd work in shifts a little bit, but occasionally we would try and get together in mass groups with them. Sometimes we'd go up to Adams Falls and have a little picnic. It was very mild times back then. This was the days before drugs were prevalent and what have you. I didn't even know what marijuana was, or Coke or anything. Coke was Coca-Cola as far as I knew. But drugs weren't involved in our society during those days. So we were, it was kind of risky to be involved with alcohol for some of them because they were under 21. Some of them, 1 or 2 of them, were under 18. I remember one fellow from, it was either Fort Collins or Greeley. I believe it was Greeley. And I think his name, I know his name was Steve. I think his last name was Cruz, but we called him Cruiser, just Cruiser. And you know, when you're just calling somebody Cruiser, we had 2 Steves working there. The other Steve was a much older guy. He's about 24, and we kind of looked. He might have been 25. And often we wondered, you know, why are you so old? Why are you working here? But and he was back east somewhere, and he was a big on reading, and he lived in the little cabin there, right there by what is now the town's marina. They got a little cabin where their office is, where they rent the stuff out, and he actually lived in that cabin. But he's by himself. He kind of was kept to himself, and didn't really socialize very much. He was, as I said earlier, big into reading. And I remember him, he was reading the trilogy of I think Tolstoy wrote it, with the Hobbits. I don't remember the name of it, but anyways, big time, thick, heavy reading. And there was a guy named Alan that worked there with us, blonde-haired, wore glasses. Don't remember his last name right now, but he was from Kansas. His parents were teachers somewhere in Kansas, and they bought what is now the Sunshine Motel in the beginning of downtown Grand Lake. And so they talked to Lyle, and because they were up there, and Lyle gave him a job. Last I heard, I think he was a minister. So he successfully made it out of our group, okay. I don't remember much more. Our general duties were just keeping up the boats, filling them with gas, taking care of the same thing Kevin Cox's people do, more or less. But Lyle Killion owned both the Cox's marina and the town's marina, and he also owned 2 ice cream stands. One right across the town's marina now, still stands. The other was down in the land that the yacht club exchanged with the town, which is now a parking lot. But you would think 2 of them, 100 to 150 yards apart, wouldn't do that well, but they both made him a ton of money. But keeping the books, we'd sit in there in a little box selling the tickets and so forth. Well, boxes. Our office was a little booth, maybe 5 by 5, about as large as a double set outhouse or so. a little nicer. But and we had to do the accounting for him and so forth. I remember Lyle, some oddities about him is that he couldn't tolerate the gas in Pepsi or Coca-Cola or whatever, and he particularly liked Coca-Cola. So since he had the restaurants, he'd get the syrup and he'd mix it with regular water, and that's the way he drank his Coca-Cola, and he drank plenty of them. But he had a bad hip or something. I remember him a lot of times walking with a bit of a cane, and that was near the end of his tenure here as far as owning the marinas. I think he kept them a year or so later, and it just killed me for him to be selling it because I wanted to buy it, but I didn't have any money. So here I was, 22 years old, and pipe dreams is what it amounted to. But Lyle put his house up in the marina. I don't remember the price, but I think he sold the marina lock, stock, and barrel for $180,000. And he sold his house a few years later for, I think, about $65,000. Lordy, what a buy, whoever bought it. But we had probably about 7 or 8 Chris-Craft boats. From a Sportsman, we had a Continental, which are brand names of the boats. We had a barrelback, which I don't remember what year it was or what it was called at the time, but it's a barrelback. And the 2 cruisers that I mentioned, and a couple of other ones. And of course, he had a lot of stuff in the shop over there. Lyle hired a mechanic. His name was Pat. I don't remember his last name, but he was a mechanic from Denver or Colorado Springs, or, well, he was a shop teacher, and from those areas there. And so during the summers, of course, he had the summer off, so he'd come up here. And there's a little small house next to the Cox's Marina over here that lawyers got. I can't remember his name. Little bitty small house right there next to the marina.
Oh, the one that Max Barber has?
Barber, yeah. And that's where the mechanic lived. And he could fix most anything. I mean, there are boats inboard, the old Chris-Crafts over coming in. People had hit rocks and things, and they'd bend the shaft or bend a prop, and Pat could get under there and fix them in no time. And Lyle also refinished the old Chris-Craft boats and so forth. So and the Jeeps would break down too, and so Pat would be up there taking care of the Jeeps. The Jeeps we used were Toyota Land Cruisers, and this is the old type, which were very similar to a Jeep Wrangler. And one of them was a hard top, and the other was a soft top. It had 2 seats in the back facing each other. You can get 4 people in the back and 2 in the front, me being the driver. And those are the ones that we would take, mostly up North Supply. The ones over to Corona Pass, usually we had an old 1940-something Dodge Power Wagon, which didn't really blitz down the highway, but and again in the back the seats were facing each other, but it was a lot of fun for us and for the tourists as well, and it went well. Those were fun days. But Kaufman House. And most of the interest in this is going to be dealing with Grand Lake, not so much Vail and other places around.
What did the Kaufman House cost you? I mean, you rented the whole thing yourself, right?
Oh yeah, I don't remember. Pretty cheap, like a couple of $100 a month or something like that. But when you're making $1.60, $1.75, somewhere in there an hour. but as I said earlier, he paid us a little bit more if we weren't staying in his place, or less if we did. But the difference wasn't enough difference to go rent a place. But, and I go back over and tell you this in a minute, but where most of the boat boys stayed was upstairs over the marina, as it exists now. And back in there where they've got a coffee shop now and offices and stuff, that was all where we repaired the boats, refinished boats. It was a paint room and so forth. So most of the boat boys lived up above it. There was one little tiny shower, a metal shower up there, because I later lived in there. You're recording now. I had a little tiny shower, one shower for, 10 or 12 guys living up there. There were only three of us, boat boys that lived away, and it was Alan that I told you about that lived down with his parents at that Sunrise or Sunset or whatever the name of it is, motel. And the guy Steve, the older guy, and now that I've discovered I wasn't 22 when I got here, I guess I was 24. Counting gets tough when you get older. Or maybe I thought I was younger too. But anyway, Steve, so he must have been 28 or 29 years old. But Steve was up there. So Steve and Alan and myself were the ones that lived away, and everybody else lived up over the boathouse. We were an eclectic group of people from all around. Like I said, Alan was from Kansas. The older Steve was somewhere back east. New Jersey, New York, somewhere in there. Me being from Texas. The particular year that I was there, I was the only Texan in the group. There was a guy that told you, Steve, that we call Cruiser. He was from Greeley or Fort Collins. And I don't remember where the other was from, but I think they were more or less local.
Whatever happened to the fellow that came up on the motorcycle with you?
Tim. Tim stayed, I don't know, maybe half the summer or so. But as I said, he was. I don't remember where he was living. Maybe he was living at the David Haven, but he was a dishwasher. And here's a college degree guy washing dishes, which, I mean, that's the way the resorts were back then. You'd find PhDs tending bar, and you still do in some cases. People have just left society and said, heck with it, I'm going to do this. But in those days, that was right after the hippie generation, or during, but our great society of the 1960s that kind of broke the mold, I think, for the generations after us. Things loosened up, society loosened up, social values, mores, what have you, loosened up. Things changed. But he stayed for about half the summer, maybe most of it, and then he left and went back to Texas. And I never heard from him again that I recollect, except I heard about him. And I know now that he's a Presbyterian minister in San Antonio. Boy, if they knew, if his congregation knew what I know about, but that's probably part of the reason he doesn't want any contacts with us. They didn't want him to know what happened. I mean, it wasn't that bad, but it was not things you'd think ministers deal with. Everybody thinks a minister is perfect all their life, I suppose. But old Tim, good old guy. But we were both pretty well just naive and headed for the hills. My dad used to come up here, which is a good bit of what influenced my interest to the area, and certainly my knowledge specifically. Some friends of ours have a ranch. They just recently sold it up in Rand, called a Roslyn Ranch. And their name was Stark, last name was Stark. And my dad he and his younger brother were classmates with two of the Stark boys. And so Mr. Stark would bring them up here often during the summers, beginning in my dad's case when he was around 13 years old. I believe he came up here 3 or 4 years during the summers. And in the mid-1930s, a trip from Texas up to here was quite involved. Usually it was via train, but they drove up sometime. And they had great times. I have a CD that Mr. Stark's grandson made from his dad, my dad's friend, his dad's tapes. They had 16 millimeter cameras that they used back then. And most of them I can't tell. Most of them are probably around where the Roslyn Ranch is. There are some cases of expanded water that I presume to be Grand Lake, but it just blips and they're not talking about anything. I don't remember if there may have been sound with it, I don't remember. But anyway, and then in those days, the high school people graduated at age, if you finished high school, graduated at age 16. They only had 11 grades. And so that put my dad graduated in 39, so that would surely have been his last year, because then he went there to college and in college for a couple of years, and then World War II. So, and he never came back up here. So.
Did you ever come back up over the years after you left here?
Oh, sure. When I left here in November, well, let me back up a step. At the end of the summer, most everybody left. Labor Day, boy, this town shut its doors. Everything was gone. Lyle closed the two little, whatever you want to call them, dairy bar type things. Food pavilions down there on the waterfront that I had mentioned earlier. But we boarded them all up. Labor Day was it. And then everybody left. Well, in this case, everybody left except for me. And Lyle asked me to stay because I knew how to work on these wooden boats and so forth. And I had anything else to do. So I stayed on with him September and October into early November. Went home to visit my parents for a week or two in middle of November, and then went back and went to work there in Vail. But golly, the town was really lonely in those days. Just hardly anybody out and around. Many businesses would close. Most of them weren't year-round. There were the Foghorn bar was open, and the Rapids, which is not what it is today, was open. It was a little bit more run down, beat up back in those days. But there was an occasion, and it was that year, and it would have been September or October. I'm inclined to think it was October because it was cold and it had been snowy out. Of course, that can happen in September, but it's probably into October.
Were you still living at the Kaufman House, or you moved into the boathouse?
No, I had moved into the boathouse, the room above it. It was one big room and just little single beds and bunk beds around. I mean, it was like a barracks, sort of. But I was staying there. The Kaufman House would have been tough with no heat at that time of year. But one night I was walking around town trying to find something to do. Again, who's around, other than a lot of older people, but there weren't many young people around. Even the lodge with all their people, they were all mostly college students, and they had left and gone back. But I walked into the Rapids, and as you come through the door in the Rapids, the main door there, you're in a little small lobby, and then immediately to your right is a fireplace and a small, I don't know, kind of a lobby area. There were several large chairs around, not straight back like these, but lounge, comfortable chairs. And they had live music from time to time. And in this case, they had a guitar player there, a singer. And I came in, and and the fire was going in the fireplace. I don't think they run that fireplace anymore. But he was just finishing a song, and I'd just gotten a beer or so and was just about to sit down. And he excused himself from the crowd and taking a break. And he went over to the bar. And as he was about all the way over the bar, this guy comes kind of staggering down, not stumbling, but staggering down the stairs, obviously inebriated. And I was sitting there watching him. I mean, nothing else to watch much, a couple of people sitting there. But he comes over and he walks out in the lobby area, and he looks over at the bar, and he looks over at the bar stool sitting there where the guy had been sitting, and a guitar. And so he turns right and goes over there and sits down. He picks that guitar up and looks at it, and he starts strumming it a little bit. And I'm sitting there thinking, who is this guy? And, hey, do you know this guy's over here messing with your guitar? That's what I was thinking. I didn't say that. And I was thinking, are they going to come get him or what? But he started playing. Well, he was pretty good. And he played this song and that song, and some of them sounded a little bit familiar. And he was saying, here's a song I wrote such and such a time, and I did this and I did that. And he finally got to a song that I recognized, which I've asked people around, and some of them say, oh yeah, a great song and today. And some of them say, who's that? But the song was called The Elusive Butterfly. And the guy's name was Bob Lind, L-I-N-D, as I recollect. But that was him. In those days, he was a little big-time guy. To me, he's a big-time guy. Because I didn't know too many somewhat famous songwriters or singers or actors or anything else. I came to know a lot of them when I moved over to Vail, because that's just the nature of the place, and over my years. But anyway, that was a kind of unique experience, to be sitting there 7-8 feet away from a guy that you thought was some Looney Tunes guy. That ended up being a somebody, but he was still inebriated, and he was staying upstairs in one of the rooms over the rapids. Why he was there, I don't know. I had some conversation with him, but how much can you talk to a guy that's pretty well loaded up there? So, and I don't even remember much about what it was. But during that fall, I'd take some hikes up into, up the East Inlet into the meadows up there, and particularly after it snowed a lot, it was real nice. A lot of ducks landed up there, and I was a big-time duck hunter, and I could hardly stand it seeing them up there. But being as how that was up in the park, I didn't do anything about it other than just look, take some pictures. You asked me if I'd take any pictures. Come think of it, I did. In those particular events, probably took some pictures of other stuff, but Lord knows where they are. I do also remember, I'm pretty sure it was that summer, and these are some stories that are off the subject. You asked me, did I ever come back? But I came back in 72, 73, 74, during the summer mostly, to see friends of mine over here. And of course, as each year went on, there were fewer and fewer of them around. And so after about 74, I didn't come back until my wife and I started coming up here. My fiance and I started coming up here. It was probably 78, 79, 80, somewhere in there. So we had a few years that we didn't. But I brought her up here and wanted to share the beauty and splendor of the area.
Where did you stay?
We stayed at the lodge. Probably more than anything, we stayed at that little motel at the end of the main street.
Brownhurst Cottage.
Brownhurst. We stayed at Brownhurst. We stayed at the Lemon Lodge. Well, we were up here a lot. I say a lot, at least once a year. And then when we bought this property, we had to have somewhere to stay until this was finished, and so we'd be up here pretty frequently, staying at some of the same places I mentioned. I think we stayed at that. You remember the Eagles Landing, Eagles Nest? No, Spirit Lake Lodge. That's what it was, on the north side of Main Street. We stayed there a time or two.
Were there other properties you were looking at buying besides this one?
Can we pause just a moment?
Okay.
We just paused here. Refresh my memory. Where were we? Just a few minutes ago.
You were talking about Bob Lind.
Oh, Bob Lynn, yeah. Well, anyway, that was something that had happened in September, but probably October of the year, and I thought that was fairly unique experience. I do remember Lyle Killion telling us that Judy Collins had previously worked at the Lemon Lodge, I presume as a maid or something like that. And I don't know how many years it was previous, but and of course in those days Judy Collins was a pretty big songstress, reasonably famous, and even more so in the up to the early to mid 70s or so. But I liked a lot of her music, but I couldn't tell you today the name of one of her songs unless I heard it. Say, oh yeah, that's Judy Collins. As a matter of fact, she moved to Vail back when I was living over there in Vail. Although none of my friends ever saw her, it was just hearsay that she was around. Kind of isolated, as I recollect. Of course, you get to some degree of stature in the world where everybody's wanting your autograph or a piece of you or somehow or another. That I probably would want to get out of the way too, but that's the price of being famous. But we began coming back here, as I said, in the late 70s, and vacationed here not every summer, but with some degree of frequency, until we finally end up buying this land here from the Ferries, and that was in 95 that we bought the land, best I remember. Might have been 96, 95, 96, somewhere in there. And we tried to get people to refurbish the house. I spoke with several different people. Couldn't seem to get anybody to come over here and look. I mean, that's just kind of a lot of the contractors' attitude, well, we'll get there, but they don't mean they'll get there when they say they'll get there. They mean they'll get there whenever they get there, which is, it's kind of hard to deal with when you're coming 1,200 miles to meet somebody. Marianne and I walked across the lake, matter of fact, would have been in 95 or 96, to take a look at the house, to meet with, I don't remember, better not mention any names, one of the local contractors. And we'd been in here before during the winter, but I don't want to walk that whole mile of a road through knee-deep, thigh-deep snow. I mean, it's without snowshoes. So I said, well, it's easier to just walk across the lake. So we went down to the parking area at the east end of the lake, parked there and walked across the lake, but not without some trepidation. But I convinced Marianne to walk ahead of me. We didn't know how thick the ice was. So she was not too far, 20, 30 feet. But the reasoning was, if I fall through the ice, she probably wouldn't be able to pull me out. But if she were to fall through the ice, I could pull her out. So, of course, fortunately, neither one of us fell through. The ice was probably 2 or 3 feet thick, but you don't know when you just latch out across the lake there. So it was a little uneasy knowing you're walking over hundreds of feet of water below you. But we made it over here and the guy didn't show up. So we took the keys to the appraiser's office. I can't remember the name of the appraisal service here in town. Took the keys over there and asked them if they'd hold the keys so the guy could come look at it. And he never even came by. And finally that spring we came back up here and I got the keys and he'd never even taken a look at it. So we went back in, looked at the house, and the kitchen cabinets were falling away from the wall. They were literally probably, I don't know how they were still being held on. They were about a foot away from the wall.
This was the old original section that Jack built, right?
The old section that Jack built. So the sign on the stairway there said that you'd bang your head into almost. And the kitchen floor was sunken down about a foot. And of course the house was a D-style log home, not insulated. The wiring in it was 1920s era wiring with a cloth covering over the wires. Certainly by far doesn't meet code. And we thought about the cost of refurbishing it. And they were drawing the water from the lake, which a lot of people do. But there was kind of a homemade system, as many people have, in filtering the water and adding chlorine to it. Many people just pour bleach into there, and that was the chlorine. And
but some of us still do that.
Well, and that's okay. But my reasoning at the time was, can't spend this amount of money on a place and not have normal water, and then one thing led to another, and when we started building this house, I decided to go ahead and drill a well, thinking with the lake here maybe 40 feet on a vertical drop from the road at the most, that we'd hit water within 100, 150, 200 feet. Well, we didn't. They were drilling the well, and they began drilling in September. And I remember I wasn't here when it was going on, but they would call me and give me progress reports. Well, we're at 200 feet, no water. 300, 400, 500, 700 feet, no water. What do we do? I said, keep going. I mean, by this is at $20 a foot, just the drilling costs. By this time, I said, gosh, we've spent so much money, we can't have a dry hole. Keep going. Well, at 740 or 770 feet, they finally hit some water, which wasn't that much water. They said, what do you want to do? I said, keep going. So we got down to 800, 850, 900, no more water. Finally, at 928 feet, the guy called and said, this is as far as I'm going. It's going into the middle of October. I don't want to get stuck back in here with the snows and have to leave my truck here over the winter. So I'm pulling out and headed home. This is as far as we're going. The good part of it is that we had an 8-inch hole through mostly rock, down 928 feet, that according to the math computation, I had a little over 800 gallons of storage in the tank time it filled up and what have you. So we've never had any problem with water. Knock on wood, hope we don't ever. But even with a lot of people staying here and a lot of baths going on in the wash machine and this, that, and the other, never a bit of water problem. But good grief, 928 feet. I found out the reason the lake's because it doesn't leak. Sure broke my reasoning at the time.
Should have drilled back that way into it. You probably hit it sooner.
Or, I don't know. I thought, worst case, maybe we go down and hit oil. preposterous in the mountain part, but you know about the oil plays here in Colorado now.
Well, do you remember what the old cottage looked like on the inside?
Yeah, well, vaguely on the inside. I mean, it just looked old. The logs were flat on the inside because they were a D style, just like this, had a little bit of flat bottom to it, and then a rough sawn interior. They were chinked, using an old type chinking.
Ochre?
As a what?
Ochre? I mean,
It was a kind of that horsehair.
horsehair, yeah.
Horsehair type rope. And then they put thin limbs or trees or whatever they were, anyway, pieces of wood that they'd kind of cut in a bit of a V. They shoved them in there. You'll see that around here and there. And that was the form of the chinking. The fireplace wasn't in very good shape, as I recollect. And I think most of the rest of the house was okay. I'm kind of a traditionalist. I hate change. I don't even know how to text on my telephone, and don't want to know. But I mean, I think if you're going to communicate with somebody, either tell them in face to face or pick up the phone and tell them voice to voice. But otherwise, why mess with it? But in that area of discomfort as far as change is concerned, I really hated to tear down the old home. I remember out on the east end, up over the door, there was a tree growing into the house, literally. It was into the house by, well, the roof part of the house. Oh, probably 3 or 4 inches. Literally just had been rubbing and rubbed the house away over the years. Big fir tree. And but over that door, I think it had the name Colonel Thomas something Gimperling. I don't remember exactly what it said, but it was. I do remember it was in metal aluminum letters. Maybe they were inch and a half tall. And then on the inside of the house, in similar lettering, that's where it was the house that Jack built. As I have been told, the original house was built in the 1890s, and it was just little more than a trapper's cabin at the time. I think it was really late 1890s, but it was a one-story. And then in the early later 1920s, I don't know who put the addition on. Maybe
it was Gimperling.
Colonel Gimperling. But there was a 2-story addition built on. I presume it was pretty well finished by 1928. So it's probably begun 26, 27, knowing how slow work goes. I say pretty well finished by 1928 because when we took out the bathtub of the old house, which was cast iron, turned it over, it had the local plumbing contractor, Spitzmuller, Gordon Spitzmuller's signature on it in 1928, written in it. Handwritten in it. So that's when the tub was set. And that was often common with old-time craftsmen that often signed their work. Whether it was plumbers or sheet metal people or carpenters or what have you, some hidden places you'd often find their name on things. But I didn't want to just tear the house down. So I paid to have the house dismantled. Tearing it down, in my opinion, is you come in and just crash everything. But we dismantled it. The people building the house that we're in now, the log home builders, Grand Lake Log Homes, and most other log home builders, when they're creating a log home, they start building it from the ground up, all the way to the roof, with the exception of the finished touch. But the beams and the purlins and so forth. And they usually build it off-site, and then they come loaded on-site. So when they're off-site and they take the house apart to transport it to wherever it's going, then the top is, of course, the first thing to go off. So it's the first thing to go on the truck. So the top, and as the truck's filling up, the middle and then the bottom. So when it goes off the truck, here comes the bottom, the middle, and the top, all in a nice sequence. And corners are marked and logs are identified that this is where it goes. They don't just stack logs and figure it out. But we dismantled it, and I kept some of the parts of the house, and then we sold the logs to somebody, and I don't remember who it was, but we sold the rest of the logs in the home to somebody who, as far as I knew, what I was told, they were taking it to Arizona to rebuild the home, or to some extent of it, there in Arizona. So they got most of the log home very cheaply. I think we sold it for $2,500 or so, which is, heck, it's a bargain. But I kept the toilets that looked brand new. I kept the pedestal sink. I kept some of the, I need to pause a second. The lettering on the inside of the older house, and I guess it's the way they connected the two-story to the older house, because I believe there was an addition on the older house also. I don't remember exactly, but I just remember the older house had a very low ceiling. I mean, I'm not that tall, I'm 5'9", but I didn't have to duck, but it wasn't that far over my head. Made you want to feel like that. Just a real, in the old days, the taller the ceiling, the more work it was, and they were generally shorter people.
Oh, I know what you were talking about. You were talking about the fixtures you reused.
Oh yeah. We reused the pedestal sink, which is still is here in the house, and it looks brand new. I used some of the beams out of the old house, although they're not structurally used here; they're just for looks. And we reused some of the knotty pine as wainscoting here in a couple of the bathrooms and such. I don't know when that knotty pine would have been put in. I don't know if they had so-called knotty pine in the 1920s. I'm inclined to think they probably did a little bit of an addition or so, or remodeling somewhere in that time. More likely the 1940s or 50s. Could have been from the 30s. Anyway, we reused it. I reused, told you I actually did reuse the toilets. Mary Ann was about to have a fit using those old toilets, although they looked brand new. But they were the old style toilets, round seat, and but I tried to keep the house, while it's a new home, I wanted it to look somewhat old and fit in, and that was part of it. But the building inspector came by and he called them, and this was after the time they changed the toilets from the 3-gallon flush to the 1.5 gallon, which don't work as good as they used to. But anyway, he caught it and made me take them out, so I had to pay extra money to go buy some more toilets. Took those toilets back to Houston, still have them in storage there. I'm gonna sell them one of these days to an antique restoration place, and they've got old bathtubs, old this, that, and the other all over the place, and people buy this stuff to do the same things that I've done in some cases. But I integrated parts of the old home with this home, mostly just for sentimental purposes, even though I didn't have anything to do with the old home, but I felt it was part of it, and if I had to take it down, at least it'd still kind of live here. I also had to tear down 3 trees, which I hate tearing down trees, even though at one time in my past career I used to be in the logging business over in Vail, logging in firewood and snow removal. But anyway, had to take down 3 trees. Dadgummit, the county didn't make me lurleen. Here we sit in a gazillion treed forest, and they made me replant 3 trees here on this land. So, okay, I'm not going to argue. I'll go out and buy 3 trees and bring them over here and planted them. But of the trees we did have to take down, I sent them to the log yard and had them remilled, and we use them as what they call the bucks around the windows and doors, and some of the finish work on, and some of the doors were made out of the lumber. All the doors in this house were custom made, not by a factory, but by an individual over in whose shop is in Granby, and he made all the doors. And so I reused those 3 trees as much as we could. And that's the way that this home got built.
What, you have some rather unique sliding doors in the house.
In the old house or this?
No, this house.
Oh, this one.
They came from a structure behind?
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that. At the old house, there was an outbuilding. There was about 8 or 10 feet wide, and I would say 30 feet long or so. And it had I think it had 6 doors, 6 little rooms. You know, they had a mechanical room, and they had a little bitty bedroom in there. I know some of the previous owners' children had stayed in it now and then. I don't remember what all the rooms were for, but anyway, it was in the way of this house. I really wanted to leave it, but we couldn't, and so I took those doors off. The old house, and we did have to tear it down. Part of it was sitting down into the dirt over the years. It had rotted away and so forth. But I took those doors off, and we reused those doors on the closet doors in several of the closets here. And they weren't sliding doors in, they were just a normal door. And we integrated them into this structure, and they are now sliding doors. So just one comes across the other. But they're used for closets. So that's another part of the old house here.
You were telling me about the number of rings on this tree out here that you had to take down.
Yeah, now that tree just died. You know, the pine beetles didn't get it because it wasn't a pine; it was a fir. I know it's a spruce. It was an Engelmann spruce. And as I counted the rings, of course, it stopped when we cut it, and I think it was cut. I can't remember, 2 years ago. But anyway, the rings count as best I could tell without a magnifying glass. 126 years. So it's 126, put it at about 1895, 1885.
Somewhere in the 1880s.
Anyway, in the late 1800s, that tree started growing. And I even counted back to my birth year, 1947, and put a little stone on it there, just out of a matter of interest. But one, I thought it'd be older than it is, but 2, golly, you sit there and think about a tree been growing 126 years before finally some beetles of some sort get it and kill it, and we had to cut it down. I hated to cut that old tree down. But you notice that there are several trees here on this porch that are, well, they're not growing into the porch, but their branches certainly intrude into the porch. And I like it. I like to leave things as natural as we can. And yeah, they block some of the view, but it's kind of, who leaves trees growing into there or that close to the house? Most builders that I know have the opinion of cut it down so it won't be a problem, but I have the opinion of leave it be if it's not a problem. And you know, it might be 20 years from now or 50 years from now, I don't know, but I like them. Even in Houston, in my own home that we built, I have a pine tree that's, I don't know, I bet it's 2.5, 3 feet in diameter. I can't reach around it. I don't know how old it is, but when we were framing our garage and we built the garage apartment above it, I had the framers notch out the roof of the house so I didn't have to cut this tree down. and they notched it out, leaving about 1.5 inch space. Well, this tree's 85 to 100 feet tall. And they thought 1.5 inch space would be plenty. And I said, you ever been down here during a hurricane? You know how these trees... So I had them cut it out more, although not much more, maybe 6 or 8 inches. Because that's only, about, 8, and it was about 16, 18 feet off the ground. But they do sway in the hurricane force winds. And of course the tree's still growing. But I don't like to cut them down. And also when we were building this house, the general contractor, which again was Grand Lake Log Homes, had to dig down into the ground in order to get the foundation, the concrete foundation for this house built. And we used some forms, which were the earlier stages of usage on these forms, called ICF, insulated concrete forms. They're made out of styrofoam. They go together kind of like Lego blocks, except they're hollow, and you pour concrete in it and stick steel rods in it to hold it together, and there you go. It's a great wall. But they had to dig down to do that. And as some people around the lake would see this hole over here where the house used to be, and those that knew who owned it, Jackson being our last name, they began calling it Jackson's Hole. And I kind of was intrigued by it because I owned a business up in Jackson Hole, and I wanted to kind of spoof them, not make fun of them, but just sort of play on the names. And so I liked it, so we continued calling it Jackson's Hole. And so that's the name of this house, is Jackson's Hole, and it happened to be the name of the boat too. So sometimes I wonder if it's really not Jackson's Hole financially. Keep pumping money into these things.
I think that happens to us all.
Where things go. But we've had a blessed 15, 16 years here. And hopefully got another 20 or so of at least being in the area. So it was a good event to have been fortunate enough to get this particular space. We looked at a couple of other houses here around the lake at the time, and they were older homes. There were no new homes for sale, and there were very few homes for sale on the lake at all at the time. And whatever was available were the older style, which were still built for, well, shorter people in the older days. And they just didn't fit the modern day structures, usage, what have you. And we wanted to be able to use it year round. So here we are.
Thank you.
That's a lengthy